My name is Ella Whitaker. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound like compliments but often feel like assignments. Responsible, mature, reliable, the calm one. I work in corporate compliance, which, if you don't know, is the department that notices things before they explode. I read contracts. I flag inconsistencies. I document details that other people skim past. My job isn't to create drama, it's to prevent it. In my family, I've always played a similar role. I was the daughter who never caused trouble, the one who helped my mother clean up after gatherings, the one who drove my younger cousins home when their parents had too much wine, the one who kept secrets, not because I liked them, but because I understood the weight of information. People tend to underestimate women like me. We don't shout. We don't compete for attention. We don't react in real time. And because of that, we're often mistaken for unaware. But awareness and reaction are not the same thing. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliating anyone. And it's not about destroying a family. It's about a moment. In one decisive moment, I revealed the truth about my father's secret relationship to everyone. And when I say revealed, I don't mean screamed. I don't mean dramatic confrontation. There was no glass thrown, no dramatic exit, no theatrical collapse. Just facts, calmly delivered in front of the entire family. The truth is, what happened that night didn't begin that night. It began years earlier, with small dismissals, overlooked comments, subtle shifts in tone, with the quiet understanding that I was useful, but not central, steady, but not significant. I didn't wake up one day wanting to expose my father's affair. I woke up one day realizing that silence is a choice. And sometimes, silence protects the wrong person. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly how it unfolded. Not just what I did, but why. The internal process, the calculations, the moral lines I refused to cross, the ones I had to redraw. Because the most powerful moves aren't loud, they're prepared. And when the truth finally enters the room, it doesn't need volume to be undeniable. Have you ever been underestimated simply because you chose not to react? If you asked my extended family to describe me 5 years ago, they would all say roughly the same thing. Ella. Oh, she's the dependable one. It was always said warmly, proudly even. My father especially liked that word, dependable. He'd say it while clapping my shoulder at holiday dinners, as if I were a well-built piece of furniture he'd personally assembled. That's my Ella, he'd tell people. Head on straight, never any drama. What he meant was, she won't embarrass me. In my family, there were categories. My cousin Rachel was the brilliant one. Law school, sharp tongue, always debating politics at the table. My younger brother Mark was the creative one. A musician, unpredictable, constantly forgiven for being late or forgetting birthdays, because that was just Mark being Mark. My mother was the gracious host. My father was the charismatic provider, and I was the infrastructure, the one who remembered to bring an extra dessert in case someone forgot, the one who texted my aunt afterward to thank her for hosting, the one who noticed when my grandmother's medication schedule changed and quietly adjusted dinner timing so she wouldn't miss a dose. Invisible labor wears a polite face. It's strange how easy it is to become background when you don't demand foreground. At family gatherings, conversations flowed around me. I would refill glasses, clear plates, and listen. When I did speak, people nodded, but rarely paused. My sentences were treated like gentle suggestions, not anchors. If I disagreed, it was framed as me being thoughtful, not firm. I wasn't dismissed harshly. That would have been easier to identify. Instead, I was softened. When I offered an opinion about my father's new business partnership, he smiled indulgently. You always worry too much, Ella. That's your job talking. When I pointed out a scheduling conflict for Thanksgiving, my aunt laughed. She's got spreadsheets for everything. It became a family joke, Ella and her spreadsheets. The irony was that they benefited from them constantly. My father especially relied on me in practical ways. He'd ask me to review documents before he signed them, to just glance at contracts, to proofread emails before sending them to clients. He trusted my competence completely, as long as it remained behind the scenes. But he didn't consult me emotionally. When he made major decisions, I heard about them after they were finalized. When he was stressed, he confided in my mother or his business partners, never in me. I was stable, not intimate. And because I didn't complain, the role solidified. I told myself I preferred it this way. I valued peace. I valued structure. I wasn't interested in competing for attention at a dinner table full of big personalities. I had my career, my apartment in Boston, my quiet routines. But there's a difference between choosing calm and being assigned smallness. I didn't notice when the line blurred. Looking back, I see how often I absorbed tension so others wouldn't have to. If my parents argued lightly at Christmas, I changed the subject. If my brother forgot to call mom on her birthday, I gently reminded him and then covered for him. You know how busy he is, I'd say. I was loyal to a fault, loyal to the image of our family as steady, respectable, slightly imperfect, but intact. My father embodied that image most strongly. He was charming, articulate, and generous in public. At restaurants, waiters loved him. At church, people shook his hand a little longer than necessary. He knew how to hold eye contact just long enough to make someone feel important. And I admired him. That's the part people assume isn't true. I did admire him. I trusted his intelligence. I respected the life he built. I believed in the version of him that he presented to the world and to us. Which is why, when the first fracture appeared, I didn't see betrayal. I saw a misunderstanding. Because when you've been trained to maintain harmony, your instinct isn't to question the structure, it's to reinforce it. And at that point in my life, I still believed that my role was to support the building, not inspect the foundation. The first sign wasn't dramatic. There was no lipstick on a collar, no suspicious late-night phone call overheard through a half-closed door, no anonymous message sliding into my inbox. It was a look. We were at a charity gala in Cambridge, one of those events where everyone wears navy or black and speaks in softened voices about impact and community. My father had sponsored a table through his company. My mother wore a deep emerald dress she'd saved for something special. She'd asked me 3 times if it was too much. It's perfect, Mom, I'd told her. And it was. I remember the lighting that night. Warm, flattering, designed to make everyone appear slightly more generous than they were. My father was in his element, shaking hands, laughing, performing. That's when I noticed her. She was standing slightly behind a group of board members, mid-30s, poised, confident in a way that wasn't loud. Her dress was understated, but intentional. She wasn't with a date. I wouldn't have looked twice, except my father did. Not the way men casually scan a room. Not curiosity. Not appreciation. Recognition. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. But there was familiarity in it. An ease. A softness around his eyes that I had seen before, usually reserved for people he already trusted. She approached our table later, introduced herself as Claire. She worked in strategic partnerships. Her handshake with my mother was polite, distant. Her handshake with my father lingered half a second too long. Small things, small enough to dismiss. And I did dismiss them, because nothing happened. No flirtation, no inappropriate comments. If anything, their interaction was professionally appropriate, measured. But I remember one detail with uncomfortable clarity. When she laughed at something my father said, he leaned slightly toward her, angling his body away from my mother. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else would have clocked it. I did. That was the first small cut. Later that evening, while my mother was in the restroom, Claire returned to the table to clarify something about a proposal. I watched my father's posture change, less performative, more relaxed. His voice lowered slightly. I wasn't eavesdropping. I didn't need to. When my mother came back, the conversation shifted immediately to neutral territory. Fundraising numbers, event logistics, safe topics. On the drive home, my mother talked about how well the night had gone. She mentioned Claire once. She seems very capable, she said. Your father needs people like that around him. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights. I responded. It would have been easy to say something, to casually ask how long Dad had known her, to mention the body language, to plant a gentle question. But I didn't, because nothing concrete had happened. And I've always needed evidence before drawing conclusions. Over the next few weeks, her name appeared occasionally in conversation. Claire sent over the updated deck. Claire suggested we restructure that clause. Claire's been invaluable on this account. Always professional, always reasonable. But the frequency increased. I told myself it was normal. Businesses grow, teams expand, new partnerships form. Still, I started noticing patterns. My father became slightly more guarded with his phone. Not secretive, just more deliberate. He stepped into another room to take certain calls. He began traveling for strategy meetings that hadn't existed before. Again, plausible. Completely plausible. If you've been trained to value stability, your brain works overtime to preserve it. You construct explanations. You smooth rough edges. That's what I did. At Sunday dinner one evening, my father mentioned he'd be in New York for 2 nights. My mother blinked in surprise. Oh, I didn't realize it was overnight. Last minute, he replied quickly. Claire's coordinating some meetings. There it was again. Her name. I watched my mother nod, trusting, unquestioning, and something inside me shifted. Not suspicion exactly, but awareness. A quiet alertness. Still, I said nothing, because at that point, all I had were impressions, body language, frequency, tone. And I refused to become the daughter who imagined problems where there were none. So, I did what I've always done. I observed. I filed it away. I waited. But here's the truth about the first small cut. It doesn't hurt much when it happens. It hurts when you realize later that you felt it and chose to ignore it. After that gala, nothing exploded. There were no obvious betrayals, no dramatic shifts, just a gradual recalibration of what was considered normal. That's how it begins, not with shock, but with adjustment. Claire's name became part of our household vocabulary. My father mentioned her the way someone mentions a trusted colleague. Efficient, complimentary, casual. Claire handled it. Claire caught that error. Claire thinks we should pivot. At first, my mother listened with interest, then with polite detachment. Eventually, she stopped reacting at all. And I told myself that that was healthy. Mature marriages aren't threatened by competent coworkers. Insecure daughters don't invent tension where there isn't any. So I normalized it. The late meetings became ambition. The overnight trips became growth. The subtle emotional distance became stress. There was one Sunday afternoon that stands out, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. We were in my parents' kitchen. My mother was slicing lemons for iced tea. My father was scrolling through his phone at the island counter. He smiled at something on the screen. Not a polite smile, not a business smile, a private one. It softened his whole face. My mother noticed. Good news. Just work. He replied quickly, setting the phone face down. I felt it again. That small internal tightening. The quiet alarm bell. But then my father looked at me and said lightly, Ella, you'd like Claire. She's sharp. Reminds me of you when you started in compliance. It sounded like a compliment. It wasn't. What he meant was, she's impressive. She understands me. The comparison lodged somewhere uncomfortable. I realized then that I wasn't just observing a possible boundary being crossed. I was watching my father slowly redirect emotional admiration, something he used to offer my mother, toward someone else. And the most disorienting part? No one acknowledged the shift. When he missed a family brunch because of a client emergency, my aunt shrugged. He works so hard. When he arrived late to my mother's birthday dinner, blaming traffic after a strategy meeting Claire was attending, my cousin joked, corporate life. Even my brother dismissed it when I mentioned Dad seemed distracted lately. He's always been like that, Mark said. You overanalyze everything. There it was again. The soft dismissal. Not harsh, not cruel, just minimizing. I began questioning myself. Maybe I was projecting. Maybe working in compliance had trained me to see risk where there was none. Maybe this was simply what long marriages look like after 30 years. Less spark, more structure. But normalization has a cost, because once something becomes routine, it stops being questioned. My father began stepping outside during dinners to take calls. Not always, just often enough to create a pattern. When he returned, he'd slide back into conversation seamlessly, as if no interruption had occurred. My mother stopped asking who it was. I did once. Everything okay? I asked lightly. He smiled at me, calm, controlled. You worry too much. That sentence again. I started noticing how often that phrase was used on me. By him, by others. You worry too much. You think too much. You're reading into it. Gradually, I internalized it. So instead of confronting, I gathered dates, travel frequency, timeline overlaps, nothing obsessive, just mental notes. The way I do it at work. When something doesn't feel aligned, you don't accuse, you document. And here's where something uncomfortable happened inside me. Part of me hoped I was wrong, because if I wasn't, Then I was watching my mother, who had built her entire adult life around this man, be quietly displaced. And I was the only one noticing. That awareness is isolating. There's a loneliness in seeing what others refuse to see. It makes you question whether silence is loyalty or cowardice. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself that marriages are complex. I told myself that without proof, I would only fracture something unnecessarily. But normalization kept expanding. My father began defending Claire preemptively in conversations that no one had challenged. She's incredibly dedicated. She sacrifices a lot. She understands the long game. He spoke about her with admiration that felt almost protective. And one evening, as he praised her insight at the dinner table, my mother's hand paused mid-air, just for a second, before she resumed eating. That was when I realized something had changed. Not in him, in me. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was measuring. And once you start measuring distance, you can't unsee it. There's a moment in every family where your role stops being accidental and becomes expected. I didn't notice when mine solidified, but I felt it. It happened gradually, like a script being revised without my approval. When my father traveled more frequently, I was the one who checked in on my mother. Do you need anything from the store? Want me to come by Sunday? Did Dad mention when he's back? I framed it as care. And it was care, but it was also containment. I was managing the atmosphere. If my mother seemed slightly withdrawn, I filled the space with practical conversations, recipes, renovation ideas, my job, neutral subjects. I kept the emotional climate steady. No one asked me to do that, but everyone relied on me to do it. My brother remained comfortably detached. They're adults, he'd say. If something's wrong, they'll handle it. That was his freedom. To assume problems resolve themselves. Mine was different. When my father missed another Sunday dinner, my aunt turned to me instead of my mother. Is he okay? I answered automatically. Work's been intense. When a cousin joked about my father's second office wife, laughing, harmless, everyone chuckled. I didn't, but I also didn't challenge it. I gave a polite smile, the kind that keeps a table intact. That's when I understood the role fully. I was the stabilizer, the interpreter, the translator of discomfort, the quiet absorber of tension. If something felt off, it was my responsibility to reinterpret it into something digestible. And my father knew it. One evening, he called me directly, not to chat, but to ask me to review a draft of a partnership agreement. Claire's name was on the header. I just want your eyes on it, he said. You catch things. I read the document carefully. It was structured in a way that gave significant discretionary power to one managing partner, him. But there were clauses tied to travel reimbursements and discretionary expense accounts that were generous, unusually generous. Is this standard? I asked. It's competitive, he replied. Claire negotiated hard. There it was again. Her influence is embedded structurally now. I could have pushed harder, asked more pointed questions, but he was already slightly impatient. You trust me, right? He added lightly. It wasn't really a question. And this is where the role becomes a cage, because when you've been cast as the dependable one, challenging authority feels like betrayal, even when it isn't. So I adjusted my tone. I just want to make sure it protects you long term. It does, he said firmly. You worry too much. The conversation ended. But something crystallized in me that night. I wasn't just the stabilizer, I was the buffer between his choices and their consequences, between my mother's intuition and confirmation, between suspicion and exposure. He relied on my restraint, and I had been giving it to him freely. The more I stepped into that supportive role, the more invisible my internal conflict became. No one asked how I felt about the increasing distance. No one wondered whether it was exhausting to carry unspoken knowledge, because I never signaled that it was. That's the paradox of competence. If you handle everything well, people assume it costs you nothing. One afternoon, my mother said something that stayed with me. "You're so steady, Ella. I don't know what I'd do without you." She meant it lovingly, but I heard something else. "I don't know what I'd do if things fell apart." And suddenly I realized, if something truly was wrong, I would be the one holding the pieces, not my brother, not my aunt, not the extended family who enjoyed my father's charisma at holidays. Me. And I hadn't agreed to that responsibility. It had simply been placed in my hands because I was strong enough to carry it quietly. That was the role I was assigned: reliable, useful, emotionally contained, invisible until needed. But roles can shift, and the first step isn't rebellion, it's awareness. That night, sitting alone in my apartment with my black leather notebook open on the table, I wrote something down for the first time. Not evidence, not dates. A sentence. If I stay silent, who am I protecting? I didn't have the answer yet, but I had finally asked the right question. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. It didn't happen because I found proof. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in the most unremarkable way possible. I had taken a half day off work to bring my mother to a follow-up doctor's appointment. Nothing serious, just a routine cardiac check. She'd been more fatigued than usual lately. She brushed it off as aging. Stress. "Your father's schedule has been hectic," she'd added lightly, as if that explained her body. We sat in the waiting room together. She flipped through a magazine without reading it. I watched her hands. They were thinner than I remembered. There's something about seeing your parents in clinical lighting that rearranges you internally. The strength you've always assumed feels fragile, temporary. When the nurse called her name, my father wasn't there. He had intended to come. That morning, he'd said he would try to move a meeting. By noon, there had been a last-minute client issue. Claire was coordinating it. Of course she was. I didn't react. I told my mother it was fine. I drove her. I sat beside her. I took notes while the doctor explained minor adjustments in medication, nothing catastrophic. But as we walked back to the car, she said something that landed differently than anything before. "He's been very busy," she said softly, almost to herself. "I don't want to add to it." Add to it, as if her health were an inconvenience, as if her presence in her own marriage required careful timing. I didn't respond immediately. I just unlocked the car and helped her in. But something inside me stopped rationalizing. Up until that point, I had framed everything as complexity, as nuance, as adult dynamics that I didn't fully understand. But watching my mother minimize herself, that was not complex. It was erosion. Later that evening, I called my father to update him on the appointment. He answered quickly, voice distracted. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said evenly. "Medication adjustment. She was hoping you'd call her." A pause. "I will. It's just been nonstop here." In the background, I heard laughter. A woman's voice. Not loud, not intimate, just present. My father lowered his voice slightly. I'll talk to her tonight. He didn't. He texted instead. That was the moment, not because it proved anything definitive, but because it clarified something essential. I had been waiting for evidence of betrayal. What I received instead was evidence of priority, and priority reveals alignment. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open again. I didn't write accusations. I wrote observations, missed medical appointment, delegated emotional responsibility, increased external alignment, no anger, just facts. And then I realized something uncomfortable about myself. I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was afraid of disrupting the image of our family as stable, because if I acknowledged what was happening, even internally, I would eventually have to choose a side. And choosing a side meant losing neutrality. But neutrality, I began to understand, is not always moral. Sometimes it's just comfortable. Over the next few days, I stopped trying to disprove my instincts. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't hint. I didn't question my father again. I simply allowed myself to see. When he canceled dinner plans with my mother because of strategic travel, I noted it. When my mother pretended not to be disappointed, I noted that too. When Claire's name appeared on a joint event invitation that had previously always included my mother, I felt something lock into place. The shift wasn't explosive. It was quiet, but it was decisive. I was no longer the daughter, hoping she was mistaken. I was the woman assessing reality. And once you cross that line, you can't go back to comfortable blindness. I didn't know yet what I would do. I only knew that if something needed to change, it would not happen through emotion. It would happen through clarity, and clarity requires patience. That was the day something shifted. Not in my father, not in my mother, in me. There's a difference between not speaking because you're unsure and not speaking because you're preparing. After that Tuesday, my silence changed. Before, it had been instinctive, protective, almost reflexive. I kept the peace because that was my role. I absorbed tension because I was good at it. Now my silence had edges. I stopped asking my father casual questions about his travel. I stopped filling in conversational gaps when he came home late. I stopped offering subtle opportunities for him to explain himself. Instead, I listened. At Sunday dinner, when he mentioned another overnight strategy session, I simply nodded and continued eating. No raised eyebrows, no follow-up. My mother glanced at me once, perhaps expecting the usual gentle logistical inquiry. I gave her nothing to interpret. It's unsettling when the reliable person stops smoothing things over. But no one said anything. My father, if he noticed, interpreted it as acceptance. That's the thing about being underestimated. People assume you're calm means compliance. At work, I was used to reading between the lines. Patterns, behavioral shifts, inconsistencies between stated intention and operational reality. So I began doing what I do professionally. I observed systems. His travel schedule began to overlap predictably with certain conferences Claire attended. His expense reports, which he occasionally forwarded to me for a quick look, included boutique hotels that weren't typical for standard client meetings. Still plausible. Always plausible. That's what made it effective. But something else changed too. Something internal. I stopped trying to protect his image in conversations. When my aunt joked again about his work wife, I didn't laugh this time. I simply said, evenly, "That joke isn't funny." The table went quiet for a second. My father gave me a look. Not angry, just assessing. Then he smiled. Ella's always serious. Everyone relaxed, but I didn't. That was the first time I allowed discomfort to remain in the room without absorbing it. Silence, when intentional, becomes a mirror. People begin seeing themselves in it. A week later, my father asked me to review another document, this time related to a new joint venture structure. Claire's name appeared again, more prominently. There were clauses about discretionary travel and executive retreats. You trust the framework? He asked casually. I trust what's written, I replied. He frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means the document protects the parties involved. If that's the goal. I held his gaze. He held it back, a fraction too long. That moment told me something important. He didn't fear exposure. He feared scrutiny. And scrutiny was something I could provide without raising my voice. At home, my mother began adjusting her behavior in subtle ways. She stopped asking detailed questions about his trips. She stopped dressing up for casual dinners out. She started going to yoga twice a week instead of once. Withdrawal doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like a quiet repositioning. I realized then that I wasn't the only one noticing shifts. She just wasn't articulating them. And that raised a question I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. What if she already knew? Not specifics, not proof, but energy. Women who have built decades of partnership rarely miss emotional distance. They may choose not to interrogate it. They may choose not to confirm it. But they feel it. My silence was no longer about protecting her. It was about deciding how truth should enter the room. Because once it does, it can't be contained again. I began carrying my black leather notebook everywhere, not conspicuously, just habitually. When something felt misaligned, I wrote it down. Dates, language patterns, travel overlaps. No accusations, just alignment tracking. This wasn't revenge. I wasn't gathering ammunition for spectacle. I was establishing clarity. Silence became my advantage. My father mistook it for loyalty. My family mistook it for passivity. But internally, I was no longer the stabilizer. I was evaluating structural integrity. And once you see the cracks clearly, you stop pretending they're shadows. The difference between weakness and restraint is intention. Mine had changed. The question was no longer whether something was happening. It was when and how the truth would be acknowledged. And I was beginning to understand that if it happened, it would not be accidental. It would be deliberate. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. There were no late-night hacking sessions, no following cars, no confrontations in parking lots. I didn't need theatrics. I needed alignment. What they never noticed was that I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking structurally. At work, compliance teaches you one fundamental principle. If something is hidden, it will eventually surface through inconsistency. People can manage lies. They can't perfectly manage systems. So I looked at systems. My father's company was partially co-owned with two long-term partners. The structure had always been conservative, minimal discretionary spending, predictable distributions, clean reporting. Over the past year, that had shifted. New marketing budgets, executive retreats, expanded travel lines, strategic consulting fees that weren't there before. None of it is illegal. None of it is reckless, but loser. And Claire's role had expanded accordingly. She was no longer just coordinating partnerships. She had become Director of Strategic Development, a title that allowed broad operational discretion. I didn't access anything I wasn't legally permitted to see. That's important. I didn't cross lines. But when my father sent documents for quick reviews, I read them thoroughly. I began mapping timelines. When did Claire's promotion occur? When did overnight travel increase? When did my mother's withdrawal begin? Patterns formed. I also paid attention to something more subtle. Language. My father used to refer to we when discussing long-term plans, meaning him and my mother. Recently, we had shifted contextually. We're restructuring. We think this market is promising. It wasn't always clear who we included. Language reveals allegiance. At family dinners, I watched interactions closely. My father's phone would light up occasionally on the table. He'd flip it face down instantly. A new habit. My mother never reached for it, never asked. One evening I tested something. "Dad, when's the next board meeting?" I asked casually. "Thursday," he replied. "Overnight?" He hesitated, a fraction. "Yes, why?" "No reason," I said evenly. "Just mapping schedules." He nodded slowly. He didn't ask what I meant. That was the first signal that he understood I was no longer simply absorbing. He couldn't categorize my silence anymore. Meanwhile, I did something else they never noticed. I began strengthening my mother quietly, not by warning her, not by accusing him, by asking better questions. "Have you thought about updating your personal accounts?" I asked one afternoon over coffee. She laughed. "Why, your father handles most of that." "I know, but it's always good to have independent access, just in case of emergencies." She studied me briefly. "You sound like you're preparing for something." "I'm preparing for stability," I said calmly. She didn't push further. Instead, she agreed to review certain documents with me. Not because she suspected betrayal, but because I framed it as smart planning. Financial literacy is quiet power. I made sure she had passwords, account overviews, clear understanding of shared assets, retirement structures, property titles, all legal, all appropriate, all protective. What they never noticed was that my loyalty had shifted, not away from my father, but toward truth. And truth requires groundwork. I also did something else. I stopped defending him. When extended family praised his tireless work ethic, I didn't add supportive commentary. When someone mentioned how lucky my mother was to have such a devoted husband, I let the compliment hang in the air, unreinforced. It's amazing how uncomfortable unconfirmed praise becomes. People start questioning their own exaggerations. One night, my father asked me directly, "Is something bothering you?" His tone was neutral. "Why would you think that?" I replied. "You've been distant." I almost smiled at that. Distance is noticeable when you're used to emotional management. "I've just been focused," I said. "Work's been detailed lately." He nodded, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He couldn't read me anymore. That was intentional, because here's what I understood at that stage. If the truth was going to enter the room, it needed to be undeniable, not emotional, not speculative, not reactive, undeniable. And that requires patience most people don't have. I wasn't collecting evidence to attack. I was collecting clarity to withstand. There's a difference. I began reviewing public records tied to company retreats, conference registrations, speaker panels, guest lists, all publicly available. Claire and my father appeared together more frequently than coincidence would justify. Still not proof, but alignment. And alignment builds confidence. By the time winter approached, I no longer questioned my instincts. I wasn't angry. I was ready. Because what they never noticed was this. While they assumed I was quiet because I was small, I was quiet because I was positioning. And once positioning is complete, action doesn't require volume, it requires timing. The truth didn't come to me in a dramatic discovery. There was no message accidentally left open, no hotel receipt slipped into the wrong pocket. It came the way most real truths do, through confirmation. My father had asked me, almost casually, to look over a revised compensation structure tied to executive travel reimbursements. Just make sure it's clean, he'd said. The partners are sensitive about optics. Optics. That word stayed with me. The document itself wasn't alarming, but attached to it was a supporting spreadsheet, a breakdown of projected expenses for the next 2 quarters. I scanned it methodically. Dates, cities, event names. Then I noticed something subtle. 2 separate entries. Same city, same hotel, same dates. One billed under executive strategy. One billed under external consultant. The external consultant line item was tied to Claire's department. Again, nothing illegal. Companies often book separately for accounting purposes, but the room types were listed, both executive suites. Identical square footage, identical rates, and the booking confirmation numbers were sequential. I stared at that detail longer than necessary. Sequential. I didn't feel anger. I felt stillness, the kind that happens when a puzzle piece slides perfectly into place. I didn't confront him. I didn't screenshot anything. I didn't dramatize it internally. I simply noted it. Later that evening, I did something simple. I searched the hotel's public booking policy. Executive suites on that floor were corner units, connected by an internal adjoining door option. Optional, not automatic, but available. The next morning, I checked conference footage from that same city. Publicly posted clips from networking events. There they were, not touching, not inappropriate, but aligned, arriving together, leaving together, standing slightly closer than colleagues usually do when cameras aren't directly pointed at them. Still no proof of intimacy, but no longer deniable. The private reveal wasn't about catching them in something explicit. It was about removing my last doubt. Up until that moment, there had been a small, persistent voice inside me saying, "Maybe you're misinterpreting." That voice went quiet, not because I had photographic evidence of betrayal, but because I had confirmation of intentional concealment. Sequential bookings don't happen accidentally. Duplicated travel lines don't align perfectly by coincidence. Adjoining suite options aren't selected randomly. And here's what mattered most. The concealment required planning. Planning requires awareness. Awareness eliminates innocence. I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a long time. No tears, no shaking hands, just recalibration. The question shifted from, is it happening, to, what does accountability look like? That's a very different question. I wasn't interested in catching them in a moment of weakness. I was interested in structural truth. So I reviewed something else. The company's bylaws, not to weaponize them, to understand consequences. If personal relationships existed within executive leadership and were undisclosed, it presented fiduciary complications, conflict of interest clauses, disclosure requirements, governance implications. It wasn't just a marriage issue anymore. It was systemic. And that changed everything. Because exposure wouldn't simply hurt feelings. It would trigger professional repercussions, which meant timing had to be exact. I thought about confronting him privately. I imagined the conversation. He would deny, or minimize, or frame it as an emotional misunderstanding. And without explicit evidence, it would become a he said, she said scenario, one that would fracture quietly and be managed behind closed doors. That wasn't justice. That was containment. I wasn't looking for spectacle, but I wasn't willing to participate in concealment anymore. The private reveal wasn't satisfying. It was sobering, because once you see clearly, you become responsible for what you know. And I knew this. If the truth surfaced accidentally, it would be chaotic. If it surfaced deliberately, it could be controlled. Controlled doesn't mean cruel. It means precise. I closed my notebook and wrote one sentence. The truth deserves witnesses. That was the moment I understood what I would eventually do. Not impulsively, not emotionally, deliberately. In one decisive moment, I would reveal the truth about my father's secret relationship to everyone. But not yet. Timing is everything, and I was still calculating. Once you know the truth, you live in a split reality. Outwardly, everything continues. Dinners are served, calls are made, birthdays are celebrated. My father still kissed my mother on the cheek before leaving for trips. Claire's name still floated casually through conversations. But internally, the axis had shifted. I had confirmation, not of a single impulsive mistake, but of sustained concealment. And with that came responsibility. The decision wasn't whether to expose it, it was how. I gave myself options. Option 1, confront him privately, demand honesty, offer him the chance to confess to my mother on his own terms. That would preserve dignity. It would limit collateral damage, but it would also give him control of the narrative. He is charismatic, persuasive, skilled at reframing. I've watched him redirect boardroom disagreements with nothing but tone and posture. In a private conversation, he could minimize, contextualize, and delay. And if he chose to continue the deception, I would become complicit by silence. Option 2, tell my mother privately. Lay out the evidence calmly. Let her decide what to do. This option felt protective, loyal, but it would also isolate her. It would force her into a confrontation without witnesses. It would place the emotional burden entirely on her shoulders, while he maintained public respectability. And there was another uncomfortable truth. If she already suspected, my reveal could feel like humiliation rather than empowerment. Option 3, inform his business partners. Frame it as a governance issue, a conflict of interest concern that would trigger formal review processes, structured consequences, professional accountability. But it would bypass the emotional core of the issue. It would reduce a marriage to a compliance matter, which, while accurate in part, felt incomplete. Then there was the irreversible option. Reveal the truth in a space where concealment couldn't continue. Not through accusation, not through drama, through evidence, calmly presented, in front of the entire family. I didn't land on that option immediately. It took weeks. Weeks of watching him operate as if nothing were misaligned. Weeks of observing my mother's quiet contraction. Weeks of recognizing how many people benefited from the illusion of stability. The decision crystallized during Thanksgiving planning. My parents were hosting, extended family flying in, a full house, laughter guaranteed. My father insisted on giving a toast this year, something about gratitude and legacy. Legacy, the word echoed uncomfortably. I pictured that dining room filled with people who admired him, who trusted him, who believed the version of him that existed in public. And I asked myself something difficult. If the truth remains hidden, who does that serve? Not my mother, not the integrity of his business, not the family dynamic built on mutual trust. It served only one person, him. And here's what I understood clearly at that point. Private wrongdoing thrives in private protection. Public accountability changes behavior. But I wasn't seeking humiliation. I was seeking alignment between reality and perception. The decision point came one quiet evening when my father texted me a photo from another strategy trip. It was a skyline view from a high-rise hotel. "Long day," he wrote. Minutes later, I checked Claire's professional social media. Same skyline, same angle, posted 30 seconds earlier. No tagging, no joint photo, just parallel existence. That was it. The final piece of doubt dissolved. I closed my phone and said aloud to no one, "Enough." The irreversible option wasn't about anger. It was about ending dual realities. I chose Thanksgiving, not because it was dramatic, but because it was symbolic. A room built around gratitude, truth, and family narrative. And I chose not to confront beforehand, because once confronted privately, he would prepare. He would restructure. He would manage optics. No, if this was going to happen, it needed to be clean, unexpected, undeniable. I began preparing for that single moment, not loudly, not recklessly, but with the same discipline I apply to high-stakes compliance reviews. The decision had been made. In one decisive moment, I would reveal the truth about my father's secret relationship to everyone, not to destroy him, but to remove the shield of silence. And once that shield was gone, everything else would follow naturally. There is a calm that comes after choosing the irreversible path. I slept well that night, because clarity, even painful clarity, is lighter than doubt. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. No dramatic mood shifts, no cold shoulders, no sudden arguments. If anything, I became warmer. That's the part people misunderstand about strategic action. It doesn't look like hostility. It looks like normalcy. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks away. In that time, I did 3 things. First, I ensured my mother was structurally secure. We scheduled what I framed as a year-end financial review. I brought spreadsheets, summaries, and printed documents. We sat at her dining table with tea, just the two of us. I walked her through joint accounts, retirement distributions, and property deeds. I helped her activate independent access to shared digital accounts, not by sneaking passwords, but by encouraging proper authorization updates. "You should always be able to see everything directly," I said gently. "It's just good practice." She studied me with that same searching look she'd given me weeks earlier. "You've been very attentive lately." "I like knowing things are organized," I replied calmly. That was true. Organization is protection. Second, I secured documentation. Everything I planned to reference publicly was either already in my possession through legitimate review or publicly accessible. I did not hack. I did not trespass on private devices. I did not cross legal lines. Sequential booking confirmations from expense attachments he'd sent me. Public conference footage. Compensation structures with overlapping discretionary clauses. Facts, not accusations. Third, I chose the format. Exposure without structure becomes chaos. So, I built a sequence. At Thanksgiving, my father would give his toast. He loved that moment. The head of the table, the room quiet, everyone listening. I would let him finish, then I would stand. I would not raise my voice. I would not insult Claire. I would not call it an affair. I would present information, alignment, and I would ask one question. But before that moment arrived, I did something unexpected. I spent time alone with my father, not a confrontational time, ordinary time. We met for coffee one Saturday morning. He seemed relieved by the invitation, almost eager. "Feels like we haven't talked properly in a while," he said. "We've both been busy," I replied. He spoke about expansion plans, market positioning, legacy. The word again. Everything I'm building, he said, stirring his coffee. It's for the family, for stability. I held his gaze. Stability requires transparency, I said lightly. He paused. Just briefly. Of course, he replied. That conversation told me something important. He believed the structure would hold. He believed he could manage perception indefinitely. That's the danger of charisma combined with secrecy. It convinces you you're untouchable. The week before Thanksgiving, Claire's name appeared on another expense summary. Same hotel group, different city. Pattern sustained. I didn't feel rage. I felt confirmation. Meanwhile, my mother moved through holiday preparations with careful brightness. Shopping lists, centerpieces, menu adjustments. She was performing stability too, perhaps more consciously than I realized. There was a moment, 2 days before Thanksgiving, when she touched my arm in the kitchen and said quietly, "You've always been the steady one." This time I didn't accept it as a compliment. I understood it as a transfer of strength. And that solidified my resolve. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about precision. I rehearsed the wording in my head multiple times, removing emotional adjectives, stripping away any language that could be interpreted as vindictive. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about ending the dual narrative. On Thanksgiving morning, I dressed simply. Neutral colors, no dramatic styling. My black leather notebook slid into my bag, not to read from, but to remind myself of the process that led here. By the time guests began arriving, I felt something rare, stillness, because once action is aligned with values, anxiety fades. My father greeted relatives at the door, charming as ever. Claire was not present. Of course, she wasn't. That would have been too obvious. He moved through the house confidently, unaware that the structure he trusted was about to shift. I watched him carefully, not with hatred, with clarity. The timing was set, and when the moment came, it would not be loud, it would be exact. Thanksgiving unfolded exactly as expected. The house was filled with warmth and noise. My aunt brought her usual overly sweet cranberry sauce. My brother arrived late, blaming traffic. My father moved from room to room, topping off drinks, shaking hands, embodying reliability. My mother smiled more than usual. That was the first thing I noticed. When people oversmile, it's often an attempt to outrun something internal. Dinner was served, plates passed, conversations overlapped. Laughter rose and fell in waves. Then my father stood to give his toast. He tapped his glass gently, and the room softened into attention. He spoke beautifully. Gratitude, family, legacy, hard work, partnership, the importance of integrity. He even mentioned my mother by name, thanking her for being his anchor. The word echoed, anchor. I watched my mother's expression as he said it. She held her smile steady, too steady. When he finished, the room applauded lightly. Glasses clinked. People reached for their wine again. That's when I stood. I didn't raise my glass. I didn't clear my throat. I simply stood. It took a few seconds for people to notice. My aunt's laughter trailed off first. Then my brother looked up. "Ella?" my father said lightly, still smiling. "You have something to add?" "Yes," I replied calmly, "I do." My voice didn't shake. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides. "I want to talk about integrity," I said evenly. "Since you mentioned it." The room went quiet. Not tense yet, just attentive. "I've spent the past year reviewing some of the company structures you've asked me to look at," I continued. "Compensation models, travel reimbursements, executive arrangements. My father's smile thinned slightly. This isn't really, he began. It is, I said gently. Not sharp, just firm. I turned my gaze to the table, not avoiding him, but widening the audience. I noticed that over the past year, executive travel has increased significantly, particularly travel aligned with one specific strategic partner. A few confused glances were exchanged around the table. I kept my tone neutral. I also noticed duplicate suite bookings under separate expense categories. Same hotels, same dates, sequential confirmations. My father's posture shifted, barely, but enough. Ella, he said quietly, warning threaded beneath the word. I'm not accusing, I replied calmly. I'm clarifying. Then I asked the question, can you explain why two executive suites were booked under separate accounts for the same nights? Repeatedly, in cities where you and Claire were both scheduled to attend conferences? Silence fell hard, not explosive, heavy. My mother's hand stilled on the edge of her plate. My aunt looked between us, confused. My brother straightened in his chair. My father didn't speak immediately. That was the second consequence, delay. In rooms like that, delay speaks louder than denial. This is inappropriate, he said finally, controlled. We can discuss business matters privately. It's not just business, I replied, still no raised voice. Because those expense structures required partner approval, which means this wasn't just personal, it was systemic. A murmur moved faintly around the table. I wasn't humiliating him, I was removing ambiguity. My mother finally spoke, softly. Is it true? Not accusatory, not loud, just direct. And that's when the real consequence began, because whatever he said next would no longer be insulated by charm. He opened his mouth, closed it, recalibrated. There's nothing inappropriate, he said carefully. Claire and I have worked closely. Travel logistics are often simplified. With adjoining suite options? I asked evenly. The room froze. I hadn't shouted it. I hadn't dramatized it. I simply placed the fact on the table. And facts, when delivered calmly, are difficult to dismantle. My father's composure cracked. Not visibly to everyone, but I saw it. A tightening around the eyes. A calculation failed. The illusion of seamless stability fractured in that moment. No screaming, no tears yet. Just recognition. My aunt whispered, "Oh my God." My brother stared at my father as if seeing him clearly for the first time. My mother didn't cry. She just looked at him. And in that look was something deeper than shock. Confirmation. Consequences don't always explode immediately. Sometimes they settle into a room like fog. Visibility drops. Breathing changes. No one at that table would ever see him quite the same way again. And I knew, with absolute clarity, that the point of no return had been crossed. Not because I attacked him, but because the truth had witnesses. After the question left my mouth, time slowed. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. My father looked around the table as if searching for a way to reassemble control. In boardrooms, he thrives in pressure. He reframes. He redirects. He turns accusations into misunderstandings. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was family. And there were no slides, no prepared statements, no neutral HR mediator, just faces. My mother's face was the one that mattered. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She didn't crumble. She simply held his gaze and waited. That waiting did something no shouting could have done. It removed his ability to pivot. Claire and I have worked closely for over a year. He began carefully. When you're building something significant, lines can blur. But nothing has interfered with this family. The phrasing was deliberate. Nothing has interfered. Not nothing happened. Not, I'm sorry. I noticed it immediately. My brother noticed it too. So something did happen? He asked quietly. My father exhaled slowly. It's complicated. That word, complicated, has ended more illusions than anger ever could. My aunt covered her mouth. My uncle leaned back in his chair, expression hardening. My mother finally spoke again. How long? She asked. Not if. How long? The room tilted on that axis. My father hesitated. And in that hesitation, the timeline answered itself. Months would have been immediate. A year requires calculation. About 10 months, he said finally. 10 months. Through birthdays, through medical appointments, through anniversaries, through Sunday dinners where he'd held my mother's hand. The fog in the room thickened. This was the third consequence: specificity. Once a number is spoken, abstraction disappears. My mother nodded slowly. I see, she said. No tears, no raised voice. Just clarity settling in. I didn't add anything. I didn't press further. My work in that moment was finished. The exposure had occurred. Now the consequences belonged to him. He attempted one final recovery. I was going to end it, he said quickly. It wasn't meant to, but even he seemed to hear how that sounded. Was going to. Not ended, not confessed. Was going to. Too late. Because here's the thing about secrecy. It depends on timing. As long as the reveal belongs to the person hiding it, they maintain partial control over damage. But once someone else reveals it, calmly, factually, the narrative shifts permanently. My mother stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically. She placed her napkin beside her plate and said, Excuse me. The room parted instinctively as she walked out. No one followed immediately. Even my father remained seated for a few seconds, stunned not by my words, but by her composure. He turned to me then. There was no rage in his expression. There was something more complicated. Recognition. You could have come to me, he said quietly. I gave you a year, I replied. Not accusatory, just factual. And that was when he understood something he hadn't considered. My silence had not been ignorance. It had been observation. Around us, the family remained quiet, not chaotic, not shouting, just recalibrating. My uncle cleared his throat. The partners know. It was a simple question, but it shifted the scope instantly. Professional implications, governance, optics. My father didn't answer right away, because if the partners didn't know, then this wasn't just infidelity. It was a conflict of interest. Another layer. Too late to fix quietly. Too late to contain. My brother stood up next. I'm going to check on Mom, he said, and left the room. My aunt began clearing plates mechanically. Not because dinner was over, but because normalcy needed something to hold on to. My father finally stood. This isn't how I wanted this handled, he said. I met his eyes steadily. It wasn't handled, I replied. That was the problem. He had no immediate response to that, because he knew it was true. The illusion wasn't shattered by anger. It was dismantled by sequence. Fact, pause, question, silence, admission. And once admission enters a room, there's no rearranging it into something prettier. By the end of that night, nothing had been officially decided. No declarations of divorce. No dramatic exits. Just irreversible awareness. And awareness is the point of no return. He could apologize. He could rationalize. He could attempt repair. But he could not restore ignorance. That option was gone. Too late to fix it quietly. Too late to pretend alignment. The family would never look at him the same way again. And he knew it. The house was quieter than I've ever known it to be that night. Not because people were whispering, but because something foundational had shifted. Conversations were low, Movements were deliberate. Even the clink of dishes felt restrained. About 30 minutes after my mother left the table, I stepped out onto the back patio for air. The November cold was sharp, grounding. My father followed a few minutes later. He closed the sliding door behind him gently. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He stood beside me, not too close, hands in his coat pockets, the same posture he uses before difficult negotiations. "You embarrassed me," he said finally. His tone wasn't explosive. It was controlled. I looked straight ahead at the dark outline of the trees. "I didn't raise my voice," I replied. "That's not the point." "It is, actually." He turned slightly toward me. "You blindsided me." I met his gaze calmly. "I asked you a direct question. In front of the people your choices affect." His jaw tightened. This was a private matter. It stopped being private when company resources were involved, I said evenly, and when Mom's health appointments were missed. That landed, not dramatically, but visibly. He exhaled slowly. "You don't understand how complicated long marriages become." "I understand contracts," I said, "and patterns." There was a long pause between us. The cold air carried no hostility, just clarity. "I was going to fix it," he said again, softer this time. I studied his face carefully, not searching for remorse, not searching for guilt, searching for honesty. "When?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately, because the truth was obvious. He had been managing, not fixing. Managing perception, managing logistics, managing dual narratives. And I had interrupted that system. "You've always been loyal," he said after a moment. "I never thought you'd turn on me." The word turn hung there. "I didn't turn on you," I said quietly. "I turned toward the truth." He absorbed that. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown back and forth, just two adults standing in the cold, acknowledging a fracture. "You could have come to me privately," he repeated. "And then what?" I asked gently. "You would have ended it, or hidden it better." His silence answered more than words could. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something closer to grief. Not for the affair itself, but for the version of him I had believed in for 34 years. "You built your reputation on integrity," I continued. "Tonight I aligned it with reality, that's all." He looked tired then, not defeated, just stripped of insulation. "Your mother didn't deserve this," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. We stood there another few seconds. Then he asked something I hadn't expected. "Do you hate me?" It was the first emotionally direct question he'd asked all evening. I considered it carefully. "No," I said truthfully, "but I won't protect you from consequences." That was the boundary. Clear, unheeded, non-negotiable. He nodded once, not in agreement, in recognition. Because here's what that confrontation was never about. It wasn't about punishing him. It wasn't about humiliating him. It was about removing my participation in concealment. When we went back inside, the dynamic had shifted permanently. My mother was seated in the living room with my brother beside her. Her posture was upright, composed. She looked at my father not with rage, but with decision forming behind her eyes. That's when I understood something fully. My role was complete. The confrontation didn't need fire. It needed finality. And finality doesn't shout. It stands still. That was the last private conversation my father and I had before everything formally changed. No slammed doors, no dramatic declarations, just a recalibrated family structure, stripped of illusion. Sometimes the most powerful confrontation is the one that refuses to escalate, because calm removes excuses, and without excuses, truth stands alone. It's been a year since that Thanksgiving, a year since I stood up at the head of a table and placed truth into a room that had grown too comfortable with illusion. People often ask, carefully, whether I regret how I handled it. I don't. But I also don't romanticize it. The months that followed weren't dramatic. They were procedural. My parents separated quietly within 6 weeks. No screaming matches, no public spectacle, just lawyers, schedules, disclosures. My father stepped down from certain executive responsibilities pending a partner review. Claire left the company shortly after, officially to pursue other opportunities. Language always tries to soften impact, but the reality was clear. Structures shifted. My mother moved into a smaller townhouse not far from me. The first night she slept there, she called just to say the silence felt strange. Not painful, just unfamiliar. That distinction mattered. My father and I speak occasionally now. Our conversations are measured, honest in a way they weren't before. He doesn't perform integrity around me anymore. And oddly, that feels more real. I don't hate him. I see him clearly, which is different. Clarity doesn't erase love, but it does remove mythology. For a while, extended family dynamics were awkward. Some people avoided mentioning it. Some quietly thanked me for having the courage. Others hinted that I could have handled it more privately. I listened to all of it without defensiveness. Because the decision was never about audience approval. It was about alignment. What changed most wasn't my father's marriage. It was my identity. For 34 years, I had been the steady one, the stabilizer, the quiet absorber of discomfort, the one who kept the peace at any cost. Now I understand something I didn't before. Peace built on concealment isn't peace. It's delay. I still value calm. I still believe in restraint. I still think emotional explosions rarely produce clarity. But I no longer confuse silence with virtue. There's a strength in withholding reaction. There's a different strength in choosing when to speak. I discovered the second one. I'm no longer the infrastructure holding up someone else's narrative. I'm the architect of my own boundaries. My mother is rebuilding too. Slowly, deliberately. She joined a community art class. She travels with friends. She manages her finances independently now. There's a steadiness in her that feels self-generated, not dependent. Sometimes we sit together on Sunday afternoons, just tea, no performance, and the quiet between us feels clean. Not tense, not avoidant, just honest. As for me, I'm still in compliance, still reading contracts, still noticing inconsistencies. But I've changed in one important way. I don't wait as long to address misalignment. Not aggressively, just directly. Because the cost of delayed truth is always higher than the cost of timely discomfort. If I could describe who I am now in one sentence, it would be this: I am calm, but not complicit. And that difference defines everything. I didn't expose my father's affair to destroy him. I did it to stop protecting something that was already broken. There's a quiet freedom in that, and it doesn't require bitterness to sustain. When people hear the title, I exposed my father's affair in front of the entire family, they expect chaos. They expect shouting, tears, slammed doors, a dramatic exit. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter, and in many ways more permanent. In one decisive moment, I revealed the truth about my father's secret relationship to everyone. Not with rage, not with humiliation, not with revenge, with alignment. That's the part I want to leave you with. Exposure isn't always about destroying someone. Sometimes it's about removing your own participation in something misaligned. For a long time, I believed loyalty meant absorbing discomfort, protecting reputation, managing optics so other people could remain comfortable. But silence has direction. It either protects integrity or it protects deception. And the hardest part is recognizing which one you're serving. I didn't stand up that night because I wanted applause. I didn't do it because I hated my father. I didn't even do it because I was angry. I did it because I realized I could no longer look at my mother or myself and pretend I didn't see what I clearly saw. There's a cost to truth. There always is. But there's also a cost to delay. If I had confronted him privately, perhaps things would have unfolded differently. Maybe he would have confessed. Maybe he would have managed it quietly. Maybe fewer people would have felt shock in that moment, but the illusion would have remained intact for someone, and I wasn't willing to carry that weight anymore. What I've learned is this: quiet people are not unaware, calm people are not weak, and patience is not passivity. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is a single measured sentence delivered at the right time. Not to punish, not to perform, but to end the split between appearance and reality. If you've ever been the steady one, the responsible one, the person everyone assumes will keep the peace, I want to ask you something gently. At what point does keeping the peace start costing you your own integrity? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Because the line between loyalty and self-betrayal is thinner than most people realize.